So when the formation, now let us see the interatrial septum, how is it formed? So when the formation of atrioventricular cushions is in progress, dividing the primitive atrial cavity and the ventricular cavity into right and left atrioventricular canals, there is formation of septum primum. This is the septum primum at around 6th week. So the septum spurium is formed in the 5th week, which is nothing but the cranial approximation of the right and the left venous valves to form the septum spurium, which is happening in the 5th week, and at the same time the caudal edges of the right and left venous valves, they join to form the sinus septum, which goes dorsal to the endocardial cushion or the septum intermedium. And the sinus septum also corresponds to the inferior limbic band, which will be between the inferior vena cava and the coronary sinus, and also contribute for the formation of the valve of the inferior vena cava. That is what is all about the sinus septum. So now after the formation of the septum spurium here above, then the septum primum at around, this is the septum primum, at around 6th week is formed. It is a sickle shaped structure that is formed from the roof and the ventral wall of the primitive atrium. And this formation of the septum primum is stimulated by the notched pressure of the bulbous cordis over the roof of the primitive atrium. That pressure initiates the formation of the septum primum. So this septum grows as a sickle-shaped fold from the roof and dorsal wall of the primitive atrium, exactly in the median plane, and the attachment of the septum primum is situated slightly to the left of the septum spurium. So this is septum spurium. Here, this is the diagrammatic representation. So this is the septum spurium. So this septum primum is formed a little left to the septum spurium, or in the venous valves, left to the venous valves, and separated by an interval by interseptovalvular space. Here you can very clearly see, since there is a space that is formed between the septum spurium and the septum primum, as the septum primum is formed left to the septum spurium, this space which is between these two septa is called as interseptovalvular space. It is so called because the septum primum is the proper septum that is being formed, but this septum spurium is the valves which have fused to form the septum spurium. So this is the right and left venous valves that are present over here. So this area is called as interseptovalvular space. So this septum primum which is being formed is between the right-sided systemic venous component, because the orifice of the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava are here, and the orifice of the developing pulmonary vein. So here at this stage there is only a solitary pulmonary vein that has been developed in the left atrium, left side of the atrium. So in between the right systemic venous component and the single pulmonary vein, the septum primum is being formed. So at first the caudal edge, here you can see, of the septum primum is free and concave, and this concavity is directed ventrocaudally towards the septum intermedium. This is the septum intermedium that is being formed by the approximation of the endocardial cushions separating the common atrioventricular canal into right and left. So the caudal part of the septum primum, which is concave and is directed ventrally and caudally, is towards the septum intermedium. So the gap between the septum primum and the septum intermedium is called as ostium primum or the foramen primum. Here it is represented in yellow. So this is the septum intermedium. So as the septum primum grows towards the septum intermedium, there is an orifice that is formed connecting the right and left halves of the primitive atrium, which is called as foramen primum or the ostium primum. The progressive growth of the septum primum will result in the closure of the foramen primum. So it gets attached to the septum intermedium, closing the foramen primum. Here you can see the septum primum has got attached to the septum intermedium. Septum intermedium is nothing but AV cushions. Please understand. So as the septum primum fuses with the septum intermedium, obliterates the foramen primum in the mid-sagittal plane. So during the process, when the solitary pulmonary vein that is open into the left half of the primitive atrium, the orifice has the right and left ridges. So this right ridge of the solitary pulmonary vein is known as sinus vestibuli, the spina vestibuli. So the spina vestibuli will get incorporated into the septum primum when it is being formed. So as the septum primum is being fused with the septum intermedium, before the fusion of the septum primum or along with the fusion of the septum primum with the septum intermedium, there is another opening or the cavity that is formed within septum primum by apoptosis, which is called as foramen secundum. So this foramen secundum, it appears in 7th week. And by the formation of the foramen secundum, it has the functional necessity because once the septum primum is being formed, you all know that in the fetal period, the blood from the placenta, it enters into the right atrium, has to go to the left atrium and then into the left ventricle and then into the systemic circulation. So when there is no proper flow of right atrium blood into the left atrium blood, then there can be stasis, which poses a danger. So the septum primum has to have a way where the blood from the right should go on to the left. So there is another foramen at the cranial end of the septum primum by the process of apoptosis that is being formed, which is called as foramen secundum, where, because in fetal life the communication of blood between the right and left atria to transfer the oxygenated blood from the inferior vena cava to the left atrium is very necessary for the left atrium to develop. So the formation of foramen secundum, it also corresponds to the expansion and rightward movement of the atrioventricular canal, establishing connection between the newly formed the right atrium and